Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling Latino economic inequality in the U.S., a topic that's as complex as it is important.
Definitely.
We're going to try to trace how this inequality developed starting after World War II, moving all the way into the 21st century.
Sounds like a fascinating journey.
We'll be diving into transcripts from a history lecture, some pretty shocking statistics,
Oh, the numbers can be eye-opening.
and even some diverse perspectives from scholars who've dedicated their careers to this issue.
It's amazing how many different angles there are to this.
Absolutely, and our mission, if you will, is to get you thinking about not just what this inequality looks like, but why it's been so persistent.
Yeah, the why is key, isn't it? It's like we're detectives trying to piece together the clues to understand how this inequality became so deeply rooted in American society.
I love that analogy. And speaking of clues, one of the first things that really jumped out at me was the income gap back in 1999.
Oh yeah, those numbers are stark. The average Latino household was bringing in just under $29,000, while white households were averaging over $43,000.
It's a huge difference.
Huge. What really hit home for you as we were prepping for this deep dive?
I think it was the poverty rate for me.
Yeah.
A full 25% of Latino families were living below the poverty line, which is double the national average.
Wow.
That number just really puts the depth of the problem in perspective, you know.
It's hard to even grasp what that means for families just trying to get by day to day.
For sure.
And I know that so many were relying on jobs in what's called the informal economy, things like street vending or house cleaning, just to make ends meet.
And those jobs, while crucial for survival, often lack basic protections, you know.
No.
No benefits, no job security, and very low wages.
It's a recipe for keeping families stuck.
Yeah, a recipe for staying trapped in poverty.
So how do we explain this disparity? I mean, it can't just be bad luck, right?
Definitely not. There are systemic forces at play.
Like what?
Well, one of the biggest factors is education.
Oh, that makes sense.
Back in 2000, the high school graduation rate for Latinos was only 52% compared to 86% for white students.
Wow, so less than half were graduating high school.
Yeah, and when you look at college degrees, it's even more stark. 11% for Latinos versus 26% for whites.
It's a massive gap.
It is, and it has huge implications for earning potential and future opportunities.
Right, but is it all about individual choices? Or is there more to it?
I mean, choices definitely matter, but you have to consider the context.
Right.
Many Latino children, especially back then, were stuck in underfunded, segregated schools, often in low-income areas.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Those systemic disadvantages, they directly impact a child's ability to succeed and ultimately to break free from the cycle of poverty.
It's like a domino effect.
Exactly. Limited education often leads to fewer job options,
Right.
which then keeps families trapped in struggling neighborhoods.
Facing all sorts of challenges.
Things like substandard housing, high crime rates, limited access to healthcare. It all adds up.
It's interconnected.
It really is. And here's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
The disparities don't stop there.
What do you mean?
Well, think about Puerto Ricans, for instance.
Yeah.
They often faced even harsher economic conditions than other Latino groups.
Really?
Research suggests that darker-skinned Puerto Ricans actually faced more barriers, highlighting the complex interplay of race, ethnicity, and discrimination.
So even within the Latino community, there are layers of disadvantage.
Exactly. It challenges this idea that everyone's experience is the same.
Mm-hmm. It's a lot more nuanced than that.
It is, and to truly understand the depth of this inequality, we have to look beyond those individual circumstances
Beyond the individual.
and consider the larger economic and social forces at play.
So those big picture things that were happening in society at the time.
Precisely. Things like the decline in unskilled labor that started in the late 20th century.
Oh yeah, the decline of those manufacturing jobs, that must have had a huge impact.
It did, especially for Latinos who were disproportionately represented in those sectors.
And when those jobs disappeared.
Many found themselves forced into low-paying service jobs, often with few, if any, benefits.
A huge step down.
It was. And even today, those service sector jobs are often characterized by wage disparities and limited opportunities for advancement.
It's like an invisible ceiling.
You nailed it. There's a lot of evidence pointing to discriminatory hiring and promotion practices that hold Latinos back, even when they have the same qualifications as their white counterparts.
It's not just unfair, it's a direct hit to their economic well-being.
Absolutely. It perpetuates the cycle of inequality.
So where was the government in all of this? Were there any policies in place to try and level the playing field?
There were programs aimed at addressing poverty and inequality, but many were underfunded or simply couldn't keep up with those massive economic shifts.
Like that deindustrialization we were talking about.
Exactly. It had a ripple effect on everything.
So it sounds like a lack of effective policy actually compounded the problem.
In many ways, yes.
It's a complex web of factors,
Yeah.
for sure.
It is. But thankfully, we have historians who've dedicated their careers to untangling these issues.
I'm always fascinated by how historians can shed light on these things.
They really can. And they've come up with some really interesting and sometimes conflicting perspectives on Latino poverty in America.
Okay, I'm ready to put on my historian hat.
Great. I think you'll find their insights really illuminating.
Just a heads up to our listeners, though. We're not going to get lost in academic jargon here.
No jargon.
We want to stick to those key insights that can help us really understand this complex issue.
Agreed. So let's start by exploring 4 major schools of thought that offer unique lenses through which to view Latino poverty.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
First up, we have the progressive school.
What's their take?
Historians like Juan Gonzalez, who wrote Harvest of Empire,
Oh yeah, I've heard of that book.
he really emphasizes the role of systemic racism and historical discrimination in shaping Latino poverty.
So he's saying it's not just about individual choices, but about these larger forces that have disadvantaged Latinos throughout history.
Exactly. He argues that things like unequal access to education and good jobs, the prevalence of the informal economy, these aren't isolated incidents.
But rather symptoms of a deeper problem.
Precisely. Symptoms of deeply embedded problems within American society.
Powerful stuff.
It is. And then we have the social history school.
What's their focus?
They focus on the strength and resilience of Latino communities,
Even in the face of all these challenges.
especially in the face of these challenges.
I'm curious, what kind of stories of resilience did you come across in your research?
Well, Vicky Ruiz, who's a prominent historian in this school,
Okay.
she's done incredible work on Latino labor history.
Oh, cool.
And she highlights a really fascinating example. The cannery worker strikes of the 1930s.
Those were some tough times.
They were. These women were facing terrible working conditions and low pay.
Awful.
But they came together, they organized, and they went on strike.
Talk about courage.
It's amazing. And despite facing incredible odds, they actually won significant improvements.
Wow, a real David and Goliath story.
It really is. And it shows the power of collective action, even in the face of overwhelming obstacles.
It gives me chills just thinking about it.
It's a powerful reminder that change is possible.
So we've got the progressives emphasizing systemic issues and the social historians highlighting community strength.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears a bit and consider critical race theory.
Okay, what do they bring to the table?
Well, critical race theory really dives into the ways that race and class intertwine.
They're not separate issues.
Not at all. They're interconnected.
So it's not just about being Latino. It's about how socioeconomic factors and racial prejudice combine to create even greater barriers.
Exactly. Scholars like Eduardo Bonilla-Silva argue that institutional racism and deeply embedded biases, they really limit opportunities and upward mobility for many Latinos.
Regardless of how hard they work.
Absolutely. It's a sobering reminder that different forms of oppression can intersect and amplify each other.
It adds a whole new layer of complexity.
It does. And finally, we have the postcolonial school.
Okay, what's their angle?
They connect Latino poverty to the long history of colonialism and imperialism.
Can you give me a concrete example of that?
Sure. Think about the relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico.
Okay.
Ramon Grossfogel, a leading voice in this school of thought, argues that neocolonial dynamics and economic exploitation have played a major role in marginalizing Puerto Ricans.
Especially those with roots in former colonies, right?
Precisely. He connects their struggles to larger forces beyond their control, to this historical legacy of power and inequality.
It's a reminder that the past is never truly past.
It's always with us, shaping the present.
So 4 different schools of thought, 4 different ways of understanding this complex issue.
It's clear that there's no single, simple explanation for Latino economic inequality.
Right. But as insightful as these perspectives are, we need to ground them in real-world evidence.
You're absolutely right. So let's take a look at some primary sources that offer tangible proof of these historical trends.
All right, time to get into the nitty-gritty details. What did you find?
Well, we've already talked about the 1999 household income data,
Those stark numbers.
which really paints a clear picture of the income gap between Latino and white households.
That's hard to ignore.
And then there are reports and studies that focus specifically on the experiences of Puerto Ricans,
Okay.
revealing the heightened discrimination faced by those with darker skin.
It's a reminder that even within a shared ethnic group, those inequalities can run deep.
They do. And there are more recent reports, too,
Oh,
like a 2008 study from the Foundation for Child Development that looked at the well-being of Latino children.
what did it find?
Well, it acknowledged progress in some areas, like health and safety,
That's good.
but it also emphasized that significant economic disparities remain.
So not a problem of the past.
Not at all, very much a present-day issue.
It's fascinating how those historical forces we've been talking about, they continue to shape the lives of so many.
They do, and these primary sources offer a glimpse into those lived realities, into the human impact of these statistics.
It's a powerful reminder of the urgency of finding solutions.
Absolutely.
I think this is a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have, from historical trends to different scholarly perspectives.
And even some pretty compelling primary sources.
It's clear that this issue of Latino economic inequality is both deeply rooted and incredibly complex.
And it's an issue that demands our attention.
In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how these historical forces continue to shape the lives of Latinos in the 21st century.
Stay tuned, everyone. There's so much more to unpack. Welcome back, everyone. It's amazing how much we uncovered in just that first part about how Latino economic inequality developed in the U.S.
It's a complex history.
It really is. I'm really curious to see how those historical forces we talked about are playing out today in the 21st century. Are things getting better? Or are those same patterns of disadvantage still holding people back?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest.
How so?
We have seen some positive developments, like the rise of a Latino middle class, and there's been a lot of progress in terms of political representation.
That's encouraging.
It is. But at the same time, those gains haven't reached every part of the community equally.
Right.
And many of those structural barriers we talked about earlier, they're still very much in place.
It's like taking 2 steps forward and then 1 step back.
Exactly. We see progress in some areas, but then those same persistent challenges keep cropping up. What were some of the things that stood out to you?
I think what really stuck with me was that 2008 report from the Foundation for Child Development.
Oh yeah, what about it?
It showed that even though Latino children were seeing some improvements in areas like health and safety, the income gap between Latino and white families, it was actually widening.
That's a crucial point. It really highlights how these economic challenges persist, even when we see progress in other areas.
It was a real wake-up call for me.
It's easy to get caught up in those positive developments, but we can't lose sight of the bigger picture. And it's not just about income, right?
Right.
We also talk about those persistent challenges in education.
Right, the lower graduation rates, the underfunded schools.
Exactly. Those factors have a ripple effect throughout a person's life.
Limiting their opportunities, their earning potential.
And it's not just limited to education. Even when Latinos do make it into the workforce, they often encounter discrimination, wage gaps.
Like they're hitting an invisible ceiling.
You said it. And let's not forget about residential segregation, which continues to concentrate poverty and limit access to quality education, healthcare, even things like healthy food options.
It's all connected.
It creates a cycle of disadvantage that can be really difficult to break.
So where do we go from here? What can actually be done to address these issues that seem so deeply entrenched?
Well, the good news is there are concrete steps we can take. We have to start by investing in education.
Okay.
Making sure that schools in low-income neighborhoods have the resources they need to provide a quality education.
Giving every child an equal chance.
Exactly. And we can't forget about early childhood education. Those early years are crucial.
Right. It sets the foundation for everything that comes after.
It does. But it's not just about education. We also have to tackle discrimination head-on.
How do we do that?
It requires a multi-pronged approach.
Like what?
We need stronger anti-discrimination laws, and we need to promote diversity and inclusion initiatives in the workplace.
Holding employers accountable.
Absolutely. It's about creating a system where everyone has a fair shot, regardless of their background.
And what about affordable housing? That seems like a big piece of the puzzle, too.
You're right. Expanding access to safe and affordable housing in diverse neighborhoods can help break down those barriers of segregation and create more equitable opportunities.
It's about making sure everyone has a chance to live in a thriving community.
Exactly. And I think we also need to recognize the power of community organizing and advocacy.
Like those cannery workers we talked about earlier.
Exactly. They showed us what's possible when people come together to demand change.
It's about empowering communities to be part of the solution.
Right. But it can't just be about grassroots efforts. We also need people in positions of power who understand these issues and are committed to addressing them.
More Latinos in leadership roles.
Exactly, in government, in business, in education, across all sectors of society.
So it's about representation, having a voice at the table where decisions are being made.
Precisely. It's about building a more inclusive and representative society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. I think that's really the heart of what we've been talking about today.
Recognizing those deep-rooted challenges, but also acknowledging the strength and resilience of these communities.
Right, and understanding that while there's still a lot of work to be done, change is possible.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive, exploring the history, the present-day realities, and even some potential paths forward.
And I think it's important to remember that this is just the beginning. This conversation doesn't end here. What are your final thoughts for our listeners?
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? Exploring the history of Latino economic inequality, seeing how it's evolved over time.
Definitely complex.
So much to unpack. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways that you think will really stick with our listeners?
For me, it's that incredible resilience that we see in Latino communities.
Yeah.
Despite all those systemic barriers, generations of facing these challenges, there's this persistent drive, a striving for a better future.
That's inspiring.
It really is. And I think it's a reminder that we can't just focus on the problems, right? We need to also acknowledge the strengths, the determination of the people facing those problems.
Right. It's about recognizing their agency.
Exactly. They're not passive victims. They're actively working to overcome these obstacles.
Yeah.
And that brings me to a final thought. What concrete policy changes do you think could actually move the needle on this issue? It's something I keep coming back to.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, and there's no easy answer.
Not at all, but it's a question we should all be asking ourselves.
If we want to create a more just and equitable society, we can't just sit back and hope things will change on their own.
We have to be active participants.
Exactly, and that can take many forms.
Like what?
Supporting organizations that are working to address these issues, contacting our elected officials, advocating for policies that promote economic justice.
Making our voices heard?
Absolutely. And even just having those tough conversations with friends and family, raising awareness.
Because the more we understand these issues,
the better equipped we are to be part of the solution.
This deep dive, it's been a real eye-opener for me.
Me too.
Uncovering those historical roots, grappling with the present-day realities, and starting to envision a path forward.
It's been a journey.
And as we wrap up, I want to encourage our listeners to keep exploring. Dive into the resources we've mentioned, connect with organizations doing great work on the ground, use your voice to advocate for change.
Every action, no matter how small, it makes a difference.
This conversation, it doesn't end here.
This is just the beginning.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Latino economic inequality.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time for another exploration into the complexities of history and society.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.